our beginning, our new worship series, Time to Rebuild Everything. And so we were actually going to be spending the next 2 months in one book of the Bible, the book of Joshua. But I don't want to start there. I want to start with something else. So in the last few years, there have been several really good movies released, and there's one that really stood out to me that I've enjoyed and kind of gone back to watch over and over and over again. There aren't too many movies I do that with, but there's one that came out in 2015 that I've done that with, and that's the movie The Martian. Now, if you don't know, it's actually based on a book, and I can highly recommend both of them. Both the movie and the book are very well done. But the basic plot of the movie is what would happen if, say, we were to send a manned mission to Mars and then accidentally leave somebody behind? How would they survive? How would we get them home? What would that look like? And how could you even imagine such a thing being possible? Well, that's the movie. I don't want to spoil too much of it, but it's really well done, and it's this really interesting look at perseverance and the idea of overcoming, and what do you do? Now, one of my favorite scenes in the movie actually comes at the end. It's actually the last scene before the credits. And in it, our main character is at lecturing, and he's lecturing a new generation of astronauts. And of course, they're wondering, did you really survive on Mars all by yourself for that long? And he has this great way that he talks about it. He says, you will face in life, sometimes, especially as an astronaut, he's like, space really wants to kill us, right? I mean, that's the truth. Humans are not designed to go into space, right? It's not our environment. It's not where we live. It's not, it is not kind to us, and will take every advantage and opportunity that it can to get us. And so that is his point. Is like, if you do this, if you become an astronaut, then you will face at some point some challenge, some obstacle that feels like it is overcomable. And they ask him directly, did you think you were going to die? And he said yes. And then he had this great thing that he started to talk about right there at the end. He's like, and when you hit those moments and you know that there's something in front of you that just seems impossible, what do you do? Well, he says, well, you begin. Right? You solve the problem that's in front of you, and then you solve the problem after that, and you solve the problem after that. You just get started. And that was a moment that always sort of resonated with me, and it was a really helpful way to think about things when we're faced with something that feels really, really hard, or really, really challenging. And so when I think about, where we are in the life, not just in the life of our church, but, the world around us that seems to have changed so dramatically in the last couple of years in a way that's probably unprecedented, what do we do? Well, you get started, right? I mean, you do what you can do at the moment. You fix the problem that is in front of you. Now, if we're being honest with each other, we've probably all faced moments like that. Some of them have probably happened in the last couple of years. Maybe it's the pandemic, maybe it's something else. But these moments come up in life where it just feels like where you recognize, the tomorrow is going to look very different than yesterday. And sometimes these are good things. Sometimes, right, sometimes you get married or you have a child, right? Those things will change your life, hopefully for the better, but they will change your life. And tomorrow will look different than yesterday, and things will happen, and you'll have to kind of figure it out along the way. Sometimes, it's a move or, taking a new job or whatever it is. There are positive things that come into life that cause us to have these moments. There are also challenges that come into life that have these moments. It could be the loss of a loved one, a loss of a partner, or the unexpected loss of a job, an unexpected move, whatever it is, where we recognize, things are going to be different tomorrow because maybe that person isn't here anymore, or that opportunity isn't here anymore, or this over here, this other thing that I rely on isn't there anymore. What do I do? Well, you begin, right? So this is actually the sort of moment we find ourselves in the first chapter of Joshua. They are standing, basically God's people are standing on the wrong side of the Jordan River, basically asking themselves, now what? Now, Joshua is actually the sixth book of the Bible, and the first five are known as either the Pentateuch or they're known as the Torah, and they really are like the core books. And if you are a person in the Jewish faith, one of the traditions that they have is they actually read all first five books of the Bible every year. So if you go to a synagogue service, they're going to read Scripture, and they're going to read from those. Part of it is going to be a reading from those first five books. They're also known as the books of Moses, and they really are kind of these definitive texts on who God's people are. Now, Moses actually isn't even in the first book. The first book is Genesis, and that pretty much takes us from the beginning of time through God's people being enslaved in Egypt. So you get the Noah story in there, you get Tower of Babel, you get Abraham, of course, is a part of that, and he is as central of a character as they get, but there really isn't a central character in the book of Genesis. But you got Abraham and then Abraham's children, and you get this whole process of a famine that eventually leads God's people to not be in the land that God promised them through Abraham, but because of this famine, they have to go south and live in Egypt. And at first, they're kind of invited in and live as guests, but over the generations, actually become slaves in Egypt. So Genesis really takes us that whole story and really is kind of the prequel book almost to set us up to the point where Exodus, the second book of the Bible, begins. And of course, that begins with the birth of Moses. And then the next four, Exodus through Deuteronomy, are all the story of Moses, and they're all the story of God's people being led out of slavery in Egypt, which actually happens fairly early in the book of Exodus, and then you get three more books of what happens to them when they're basically wandering the wilderness. And of course, what happens to them is all sorts of things, but one of the things that happens is Moses has these experiences of God. Moses, gets the tablets, the very Charlton Heston moment, with the tablets. But really, what happens in this time that the Israelites are wandering in the desert, trying to get to the promised land, but unable to get there, is they really become a people and then become defined as a people. And the thing that's going to define them as a people is God gives them some rules and some practices to follow and says, you will practice these things. You won't do other things. You will do these things. This is how you'll interact with each other. This is what, this is how you will live in a community that is based in justice and right and wrong and all those sorts of things. So those four books are really the story of God's people becoming a people and learning what it is that God expects of them. And that takes us throughout Moses' entire life. And at the end of the fifth book, the book of Deuteronomy, the end of the fifth book, we get the death of Moses. And what's interesting is that he dies on the wrong side of the Jordan River. He dies not in the promised land. He can see it. He can see the promised land. And he was told by God this was going to happen, by the way. But he can see the promised land from where he is, but he's on the wrong side of the river when he dies. And his last act is to really sort of hand over leadership to his able assistant, Joshua. Now, I find this fascinating. And I find it fascinating for a lot of reasons. But I think about that moment, right? I mean, so say you had been part of reading, all five books of those the Torah throughout the year, and you get to the end, where they're right there, they're on the Jordan, they're not quite where they need to be yet, and then Moses dies and then passes on leadership, and then you go all the way back to the beginning. Right? And it's kind of left almost like Deuteronomy really kind of leaves off the Torah with a bit of a cliffhanger. Like what's going to happen now kind of moment. And if we actually go through the Bible, especially the Old Testament, especially, has a lot of those cliffhanger moments. A much shorter book, the book of Jonah, which is only 4 chapters, not 5 books, but the book of Jonah ends in a very similar way. It just kind of ends, right? Jonah is sitting on a tree, and he's sitting under a tree, mad at God, and that's it, curtain closed. And I find it interesting that there was this level of comfort with that idea that you could just leave a story in that place, and that was okay, and that you could go back to the beginning. I think for us today, we struggle with that. We want to know the ending. We want to know what the resolution is, right? You're left with that now what moment? What's going to happen to God's people? Their leader is gone, and they're still on the wrong side of the Jordan. Well, of course, the story doesn't actually end there, and if you want to, you can keep reading, and of course, we keep reading into the book of Joshua. And so here we have Joshua basically being given the mantle of leadership and being told, okay, now you need to go do this thing. And here's this vast group of land, this great group of land, the land that I promised to Abraham, the land that has been set aside for you by God. Now you need to go and actually go and live and take that land. And that had to feel like an impossible task at that moment. Now, they'd actually earlier sent spies over. They'd actually checked it out, and they'd kind of see what they'd be up against. It's part of the reason they were still hanging out on that side of the river, is they realized that they were going to be up against some pretty tremendous odds if they were going to do this thing that they felt God calling them to do. And in fact, Joshua himself was one of the people who went across and kind of spied on the land, and brought back some of these reports. And a couple people brought back reports that there's giants out there, and this is going to be so terrible and awful. And people are like, we're not sure we want to do this. Can't we just stay here? That's a bit of a theme amongst God's people. They're like, well, this looks nice. We can just stay here. Why would we want to go forward? Why would we want to do something new? So what we're going to deal with for the next couple of months, actually, in the book of Joshua, is that story of how they go about doing this thing that I'm sure at that moment seems impossible. And of course, they do it in the way that all of us do impossible things. One step at a time, one day at a time. And for them, that first step is they've got to cross the Jordan. They can't do anything until they begin, and they can't begin until they cross the river. That is their first step. That is what they need to do next. And it is sitting there right in front of them, and they are just waiting for that time and the place to come when they can finally take a step across and into this place that God promised them. We are also talking this morning right at the beginning of a new year. And of course, New Year's are great. This year, because of all the sickness and everything, I pretty much slept through New Year's. I didn't stay up or anything like that. But New Year's is amazing because it gives us an opportunity, right? And one of the popular things you do, right here, on New Year's is people will make New Year's resolutions, right? And to the point that it's almost become almost like a joke, right? Like you make New Year's resolution, you join the gym, and then 3 weeks later you quit or whatever. There's this weird, almost sort of backlash against New Year's resolutions. If you type New Year's memes, you'll get a bunch like this. And it is true, you won't break your New Year's resolutions if you don't make any. And some have called into question the whole practice of basically making a resolution on New Year's, and is that really effective, and yada yada yada. And of course, people have studied this because people study everything. And studies have found that while it's true, most people when they make New Year's resolutions don't keep them. It's also true that some do. And there's actually times in life and times throughout the year where people are statistically significantly more likely to keep a resolution or keep like a life change than other times. And one of those times is New Year's. You're better off, statistically speaking, making a resolution at New Year's than you are on some random Tuesday. The chances are you will keep it. The one that actually works better, they have found, the time that actually works better for making a lifestyle change or something like that is actually your birthday. People are far more likely to keep a change, keep something going, if they start it on their birthday. And then the last one is, the other one they found is it's statistically more likely that you will actually keep a resolution if you start it on a Monday. I don't know, So really, we need, as human beings, we crave the idea of a beginning, right? Like we need a moment to mark that says, tomorrow is going to be different than yesterday. Sometimes in life, those moments are thrust on us, right? Like we talked about at the beginning, sometimes something happens to us that makes makes tomorrow different than yesterday, whether we want it to be or not. And sometimes what we have to do is we've got to make one. We basically have to manufacture that opportunity to say, here is a starting line, right? I maybe don't know where the finish is, but I'm going to declare this the start and this the first step in that direction. That is what the Israelites need if they're going to get to where God needs them to go. And they take the death of Moses and the ascension of Joshua as a starting line to say, okay, now it is the time to take a step forward. Now it's a time to cross the river and go to that place that God needs us to go. Sometimes we have that opportunities in our lives that are thrust upon us. Sometimes we need to make our own. So New Year's is as good as any other time to decide to change something or do something differently. Don't let anybody discourage you from taking that first step. You may stumble on the third or the fourth step, and you may never actually find the finish line. But I can guarantee you won't find the finish line if you don't first find the starting line. And if one is not given to you, sometimes we have to claim one for ourselves. Now, often in life, we are confronted with things that just seem too hard. Often in life, we are confronted with challenges that we're not sure how to overcome. And there's a reason that in the back of our church, there hangs a sign that says, you can't do everything, so do something. Sometimes the everything we are faced with feels far too challenging. We have lived through that in our little part of the world in the last few days. I don't know what to do about 500 homes that were destroyed. I don't know what to do with all the challenges that will arise after that. I do know that we can do something. And those times when I am proudest of us as a church, the times that I am proudest of us as a community, and the times that I feel like we are best living out our calling to be an outpost for God's kingdom, because that's what the church is. We are an outpost for God's kingdom. The times when we most act like that is those times when we see something going on and we say, what's the something that I can do? When the fires hit, there was, within hours of the news going out that something very bad was happening just south of us. Emails were already flying amongst members of our disaster response team about what we want to do. Of course, we already did something a couple of months ago when Denton had their fires, and we cleared out our storeroom thinking, we'll have the spring to rebuild before there are fires again. Well, little did we know. So we could have said, we have an empty shed. We'd love to help, but we don't have anything to offer at this moment. Instead, what happened was a whole bunch of emails flying around about how can we do something? How do we get going? What do we have? How do we start ordering? And I can already tell you that shopping has been done and Amazon have been ordered and supplies to build. Initially, we wanted to build 50 kits. I think at this point, we're trying to build 100 kits, in the next few coming days so that we have them on hand to offer them as the something we can do in this moment. Is it everything they need? No, of course not. There will be work to do for us and for others for no doubt weeks and months, if not years, to come. But in the face of that idea of weeks and months of years of work, we will always have a choice, which is to do nothing, to say that's too big a thing for us, that's too big a challenge for us, that's not anything we can do anything about, we can't fix all the problems. Or we can give ourselves a starting line, we can say this is the place we can begin, and we can take that first step. And I'm always proudest of us when we do that. God's people needed to cross the Jordan. God's people needed to take that first step. They had to take it even though the odds did not seem in any way in their favor. They needed to take it even though the challenge in front of them looked hard and difficult and vast and probably beyond them. But they would never know, and they would never get where they needed to go if they didn't first begin. What do you need to begin? What is your Jordan River that you are standing on the wrong side of? And what is that first step that you need to take? It may be something small, or it may be something big. It may be an opportunity that is in front of you that you need to take advantage of. It may be a challenge or a loss that you need to find your way through. Whatever it is, the good news that we know, as people of faith and as people, as workers at this particular outpost of God's kingdom, is that we have with us the same thing that the Israelites had all those many years ago when they were standing in front of the river. And of course, that thing that we have with us, that they had with them, is God. They had a calling from God to go and do. We all have a calling on our lives to be happy and to go and do the things that God needs us to do. We just have to decide where the start line is and take the first step. So take this New Year's, or take your birthday, or take whatever random Monday you need. Give yourself a start line and say, I'm going to begin to do the thing that I feel God calling me to do. Amen.